Hello and welcome to Almanac North. Thanks for watching. And Denny, we'd like to welcome the audience that has joined us for the first time at 5:30 p.m. on Friday.
That's right, and not to fret, the show will also be seen tonight at 8 o'clock on regular Channel 8.
That's true, and we have some interesting guests this week, so let's get started.
All right, thank you very much, Julie, and welcome everyone. Well, according to the United Nations, every 20 minutes somewhere in the world, people leave behind everything to escape war or persecution. Next Thursday, June 20th, has been designated World Refugee Day, an effort to educate the general public about this issue. Here at home, a UW Superior professor is spreading the word about refugees through his work with the Wisconsin Humanities Council. And so, joining us now is Haji Dokhanchi. Haji is a political science professor and social inquiry chair at UWS. Professor, thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Now, I know a lot of people are wondering talking about refugees coming into this country. Are we seeing more refugees today than, say, we did a generation ago?
Absolutely. The numbers have skyrocketed. If you look at roughly about 10 years ago, the number of refugees tend to be hover around 33 million. Now the number is close to 70 million. As a matter of fact, there were 5 million additional refugees just last year.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about refugees, what's the definition that you use? Because a lot of people use the term, refugee, migrant kind of interchangeably, but they're very different.
There is a very legalistic, it is a legal term based in the 1951 Refugee Convention, and essentially it says you are a refugee if you leave your country for the well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and or membership in a social group. So you have to meet that particular qualification to be classified as a refugee.
Is a refugee issue a crisis?
It depends on perspective. The numbers have clearly increased enormously. So there is a crisis in the sense that we used to have refugees in a smaller numbers and countries used to deal with the issue, but the numbers have increased in such a magnitude that you are seeing a serious breakdown of the system. So for example, Turkey now has close to 3 million refugees in Turkey. Lebanon has 1 million. Jordan has close to 1 million. Iran has 1 million. Pakistan has a 1.5 million, and most of these countries are developing countries, so they don't have the necessary infrastructure and means to deal with this issue.
So who does have the responsibility then to assist the refugees in a country where there isn't the infrastructure and the resources and provide the food and the clothing and the shelter that they need so they're safe in their new location?
Well, I think this is one of the reasons that makes this particular issue interesting, because UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, is the global institution that's supposed to be coordinating protection. But then it is up to the individual countries to do this. And as you move, so for example, let's say you're a Syrian refugee, you go to Turkey, and Turkey may not have the means to provide you the services that you want. So usually what happens, and this is one of the reasons why people say, why are you coming to Europe? Why can't you stay in Turkey? Well, if you're excluded from economic participation, if your kids are excluded from educational institutions, clearly you don't want to stay in that country. So you move on to the next country. And then, so this is where the issue emerges, who is responsible for the well-being of that. And the refugees are interested in improving their lives. So the last thing they want to do is go from a country in which they have very low standard of living or opportunity to enrich themselves and their families. So they want to move to countries in which they're able to meet those needs.
So can so many refugees from one country change the face and character of another country or city?
Well, yes. For example, if you look at Utica in upstate New York, they allowed a large number of Bosnians and other migrants to come in there. So the composition of the city has changed. I think 2 weeks ago there was an article in Minneapolis saying that one of the cities in Minnesota has essentially been able to maintain its population base essentially because of the inflow of refugees. Yes, it does. It doesn't mean anything. As you travel, for example, in upstate, in the northern part of Minnesota, you will see many cities that have had migrants from Korea Croatia, migrants from Slovenia, migrants from Finland, and they proudly put those flags all over the place. So I don't think it necessarily the change in the composition should be something that would
not to fear.
Not to fear, yes.
Mm-hmm. Are we seeing an influx of refugees up in the communities in our region currently?
Not that I am aware of. No, I have not seen that. Minnesota is relatively much more liberal in terms of allowing refugees. So, for example, if you look at the number of refugees that have settled in Minnesota versus Wisconsin, Wisconsin has roughly about 13,000 refugees. Minnesota has about 40,000 refugees.
What are some of the challenges for refugees coming to a country like the United States from parts of the world that are very, very different culturally and economically?
Well, the issue is in many cases that first and foremost, language is a barrier. So you have to know the language. Culture is a barrier sometimes. Sometimes you may confront discrimination. Sometimes, for example, you may be established at home. For example, you may be a physician, but when you come to the United States, there are a host of different requirements that you have to have in order to practice medicine. So you can't necessarily be a doctor, so you may have to settle for some other position within the healthcare system. So there are a number of issues. And the other one that you have to really deal with is the 69,999 refugees, which is that every time they do something, you're automatically suspected of being in cahoots with them. So you really have to worry about the conduct of everybody else who happens to be in that category.
Haji, talk to us a little bit about how difficult it might be, it will be, for a refugee to return someday to his or her home country.
I don't think it's difficult at all. It's just a matter of circumstances at home. So, for example, in Afghanistan, the situation has changed a little bit. Now, Afghanistan is not the most stable country, as we know, but many of the refugees in the neighboring countries are now returning home only because it's not as bad as it used to be. So it is possible for them to go home. The only thing you have to keep in mind is that according to the 51 Convention, you cannot force people to return to their homes. So there's no forced repatriation. The other part is that you cannot force them to go home if they encounter any danger. So there is a French term, non-refoulement, which means essentially if there is a danger to them at home, you should not be sending them. Now, some countries are doing some interesting things around this, which I don't know if they are exactly legal. But for example, what you find is that you find a third country that's stable. So you just say, for example, I will not host you in my country, but I will transfer you to a third country. So for example, Australia for a while was sending their refugees to other countries and saying that as long as these countries are safe, this would be the case. We are seeing a kind of a variation of this now. So for example, the United States is saying Mexico is a stable country. And what this means for refugees coming through Mexico to the United States is that now you have a first country that is stable. So why don't you apply for refugee status in Mexico? So essentially this gives us the chance to say, you can stay in Mexico, don't bother coming up here, because if you are in Mexico and we deem Mexico to be democratic and stable country, then you should be seeking refugee status there. European countries are doing exactly the same thing with Turkey for refugees coming from Afghanistan, Syria, or Iraq, and they're also doing the same thing in Libya, Morocco, and Algeria, and Egypt for refugees coming from sub-Saharan Africa.
Sure.
So essentially the idea is that if we deem these countries to be safe, then you should be seeking refugee status in those countries.
What kind of vetting process is there for refugees before they come into the United States? Because I think that there are concerns that their countries of origin don't have the record keeping that other more developed countries might have, or countries that aren't under the same duress. But how long does it take for somebody to come to the United States, and what do they go through?
On average, it takes about 18 to 24 months. So this is a very elaborate process, and as far as I know, there is when President Trump was elected, one of the pledges that he made was to make the process even more rigorous, and as a result of that, now they have changed the policy. So one of the things that they will ask you is to share your social media and your telephone, and they can go over all your information for the past 5 years. But in addition to that, as a regular process, even before that, you would have to go through like counterterrorism organizations, FBI organization in the United States, in National Homeland Security, as well as the State Department, and they will check your name against all the list to make sure that you are not doing anything. So they would actually try to authenticate as much as possible. But you know, part of the problem is that this is not a foolproof system. So, for example, let's say you're a Christian from Iraq that's being persecuted, and you want to establish that you're a Christian, but then how do you do this? You know, how many? And I ask this to my students: how many of you can say the first verse of the Bible? And only about a third of the class can raise their hand. So you know, this is the difficulty of trying to establish identity and means by which they're being persecuted.
And Professor, with that, we have to say goodbye. Thank you so much for being here.